The storm's whisper. The sky was a brooding shade of slate gray, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the earth like a suffocating blanket. The air was thick with the scent of impending rain, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed through the hills like the growl of some ancient beast. It was the kind of day that made most people stay indoors, curled up with a book or a warm drink. But for three friends, Ethan, Claire, and Marcus, it was the perfect day for an adventure. The three had been inseparable since childhood, bound by their shared love of the mysterious and the macabre. They had explored abandoned houses, wandered through dark forests, and even spent a night in a supposedly haunted cemetery. But today they were after something different. They had heard rumors of an old forgotten cabin deep in the woods, a place that was said to be cursed. According to local legend, anyone who spent a night in the cabin during a thunderstorm would experience something unnatural. Ethan, the most skeptical of the group, had dismissed the stories as mere superstition. Claire, ever the thrill seeker, had been eager to investigate. Marcus, the quiet and thoughtful one, had agreed to go along, though he couldn't shake a sense of unease. And so, armed with flashlights, snacks, and a sense of bravado, they set out into the storm. The rain began to fall just as they reached the edge of the woods. A steady drizzle that quickly turned into a downpour. The trees swayed and groaned in the wind, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The friends trudged through the mud, their flashlights cutting through the gloom as they followed a narrow, overgrown path. After what felt like hours, they finally spotted the cabin. It was a dilapidated structure, its wooden walls warped and rotting, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The windows were dark and shattered, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. It looked like the kind of place that should have been torn down decades ago. "Home, sweet home," Claire said with a grin, though her voice wavered slightly. They pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was damp and cold, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and the walls seemed to close in around them. But despite the eerie atmosphere, they managed to set up camp in the main room, spreading out their sleeping bags and lighting a few candles to ward off the darkness. For a while, everything was fine. They told stories, laughed, and tried to ignore the occasional creak or groan of the old cabin. But as the storm outside intensified, so did the strange occurrences within. It started with the whispers. At first, they were so faint that they could barely be heard over the sound of the rain. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, each hoping the others would dismiss it as their imagination. "Did you hear that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Claire replied, her usual bravado gone. "It sounds like voices." Ethan shook his head. "It's just the wind. Old places like this make all kinds of noises." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were coming from within the cabin, from the shadows that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering candlelight. Then came the tapping. It started as a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone gently knocking on the walls. But soon it grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was making the noise was desperate to get their attention. The friends huddled together, their flashlights darting around the room as they searched for the source of the sound. "Maybe we should leave," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "No," Claire said, though her face was pale. "We came here to experience something, and we're not leaving until we do." But as the tapping turned into pounding, and the whispers grew into screams, even Claire began to have second thoughts. The candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The air grew colder, and the friends could see their breath fogging in the dim light of their flashlights. And then they saw it. In the corner of the room, a figure began to materialize. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by shadows. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. The friends froze, their hearts pounding in their chests as the figure stepped closer. "Who? What are you?" Ethan stammered. Though he already knew the answer, the figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a bony hand and pointed to the door. The pounding stopped, and the whispers fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of the storm outside. And then, the door slammed shut. The friends screamed as the figure lunged toward them, its claws outstretched. They scrambled to their feet, tripping over each other in their panic. Claire grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, and they tumbled out into the rain. They ran through the woods, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they stumbled over roots and rocks. The storm raged around them, the wind howling like a banshee. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the woods, collapsing onto the wet grass as they gasped for breath. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the sun shone brightly in a clear blue sky. The friends sat in silence, their faces pale and drawn. None of them spoke of what had happened in the cabin, though the memory of it haunted their dreams. Years later, they would still wake in the middle of the night, their hearts racing as they heard the faint sound of whispers in the dark. And though they never returned to the cabin, they knew that whatever they had encountered that night was still out there, waiting for the next storm to unleash its fury. The storm's whisper had spoken to them, and it would never let them forget. Months turned into years, and the friends drifted apart, each carrying the weight of that night in their own way. Ethan buried himself in work, trying to rationalize what he had seen. Claire became obsessed with the paranormal, chasing after every ghost story and urban legend in the hopes of finding answers. Marcus, however, couldn't escape the feeling that something was still watching him. One night during another thunderstorm, Marcus found himself drawn back to the woods. He didn't know why he went. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was something else, something darker. As he stood at the edge of the forest, the rain soaking through his clothes, he heard the whispers again. This time they were calling his name. Against his better judgment, he stepped into the woods. The path was overgrown, but he found his way to the cabin. It looked exactly as it had that night, as if time had stood still. The door creaked open on its own, and Marcus stepped inside. The air was colder than he remembered, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder, a hand that wasn't there. He turned around, but there was no one there. The whispers turned into laughter, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the cabin. Marcus tried to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the figure from that night, its yellow eyes glowing with a malevolent light. And then there was only silence. The next morning, Marcus was gone. His friends searched for him, but there was no trace of him anywhere. The cabin was empty, as if no one had been there in years. But sometimes, during a thunderstorm, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers. And if you're unlucky enough to find the cabin, you might just see the figure with the yellow eyes, waiting for its next victim. The storm's whisper never forgets. Years after Marcus's disappearance, Ethan and Claire found themselves drawn back to the woods, compelled by a force they couldn't explain. They had tried to move on, to forget the horrors they had witnessed, but the memory of that night lingered like a shadow over their lives. As they stood at the edge of the forest, the sky darkened once more, and the first drops of rain began to fall. They exchanged a glance, their faces pale and drawn, and without a word they stepped into the woods. The path was overgrown, but they found their way to the cabin. It looked exactly as it had that night, as if time had stood still. The door creaked open on its own, and they stepped inside. The air was colder than they remembered, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and they felt a hand on their shoulders, a hand that wasn't there. They turned around, but there was no one there. The whispers turned into laughter, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the cabin. They tried to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The last thing they saw before the darkness consumed them was the figure from that night, its yellow eyes glowing with a malevolent light. And then there was only silence. The storm's whisper had claimed its next victims, and the legend of the cabin lived on. Those who dared to venture into the woods during a thunderstorm would hear the whispers, and if they were unlucky enough to find the cabin, they would see the figure with the yellow eyes, waiting for its next victim. The storm's whisper never forgets, and it never lets go. The storm lasts in their minds for the rest of the life.